So our final speaker for the evening is Professor Bruce Robinson, an endocrinologist. His research is focused on identifying the genetic changes which either predispose or directly cause endocrine tumours, and amongst other highlights has been the formation of an international consortium of families from around the world to decipher and study medullary thyroid cancer of pheochromocytoma. He's been the head and remains the head of the Cancer Genetics Unit of the Colling Institute of Medical Research at North Shore from 1989, continues to practice at Royal North Shore Hospital. He's the chair of the NHMRC and chair of the MBS Review. Bruce, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk tonight, and thank you all for being here too. I only have a few slides to talk to you about the use of what are called systemic therapies, that is, therapies that are taken orally in this particular case, that are used in patients who've got to the stage in their disease where they're failing to respond to radioactive iodine that you've heard about tonight, which works in the vast majority of patients. So this is what we call advanced iodine refractory differentiated thyroid cancer. And I entitled this slide the pros and cons of treatment, because this is not a cakewalk. And we do need to select patients very carefully for these treatments, just the same as we select carefully those patients who need radioactive iodine and those patients who may not need radioactive iodine. So there are a number of factors that one has to consider when talking to a patient about whether they are a candidate for this disease. Some of these we've already heard about tonight: the histologic subtype, the nasty subtypes that are listed there. We need to have a good appreciation of the actual volume of disease that a person has, how quickly that disease is growing, if there are any symptoms that are present at the moment, and if there are any symptoms that are likely to start developing. And then we need to think about what the treatment options might be. We need to also consider how well the treatment might work, what its limitations are, what are the side effects of it and the impact upon the quality of life, and overall what makes sense for the whole patient. So just as with all of the forms of thyroid cancer therapy that you've been hearing about tonight, this is very much personalised and dependent upon the patient and their particular needs. Now, I've touched on the nature of the disease and the rate of its progression. It's now generally fairly well regarded that progression of disease that's demonstrated on standard scans, particularly CT scans, over the preceding 12 to 14 months is a factor which really ought to be present before you consider a patient for one of these systemic therapies with what are known as tyrosine kinase inhibitors, or TKIs for short. As endocrinologists, we've had to get used to using this set of criteria called RESIST, which oncologists are all very well used to using for the trials that they undertake of drugs, chemotherapy drugs, but we have not been used to using those until relatively recently, and this is a set of criteria where we have to be able to demonstrate progression, which is defined as being a greater than or equal to 20% increase in the sum of the longest diameter of what are called the target lesions. So when you look at the scan of a patient, 2 scans taken 12 months apart, you have to pick a number of lesions and then decide that they're called the target lesions. You measure the longest diameter of each of those lumps of tumour, and you have to see a greater than or equal to 20% increase in the sum of the longest diameter of these target lesions before that qualifies as being defined as progression. We need to consider the burden of disease too, the total sum of disease that a person has, any symptoms that they might be experiencing from it, any other comorbid conditions that they might have as well, and of course we have to take into account the patient preference. When you describe the potential side effects of some of these drugs to patients, not all of them are willing to sign up. As I've said, this is not a cakewalk. We are still relatively in our infancy in learning how to manage these drugs, how to manage the dose of them, how to choose the starting dose, how to manage side effects should they begin to occur. So, 2 different examples of patients, one of whom might need treatment and another of whom might not. This patient, number 1, has metastatic papillary thyroid carcinoma with a number of small lung nodules that you can see on this CT scan in here. They also have a moderate-sized pleural effusion, they have cough, and they have shortness of breath. So this patient is quite clearly symptomatic, and I think most of us would agree that that patient is a good candidate for treatment. Second patient has metastatic Hürthle cell carcinoma. Again, small lung nodules seen on the scan here. No other disease that's relatively slowly progressive. The question is, does she really need treatment or not? And I think these are important questions that we need to ask, not just of ourselves, but also discuss clearly with the patient. So the question that now we are being asked increasingly by patients and by our colleagues is, why shouldn't everyone who's got iodine refractory recurrent metastatic differentiated thyroid cancer get treatment right now? And by getting treatment, all of these patients, if they're resistant to radioactive iodine, should also still be having suppressive thyroid hormone therapy, so treatment with thyroxine to keep their TSH low, because we know that's a factor that contributes to better outcomes. The reasons why we're even asking this question is that this treatment is not potentially curative. It helps to slow down the rate of progression of disease. We don't have very clear evidence about it prolonging life. And the other question that we don't have a good answer to is when we should actually start this treatment. These trials that have been undertaken, and I'll show you some data from shortly, have been undertaken in patients generally with fairly advanced disease. We still don't have an answer to the question as to whether that's the right patient to begin this treatment in. Should we begin the treatment in patients with earlier stage disease to get better benefit from it? And the second problem with these treatments is that almost everyone who is on these treatments will get some symptom side effects, and there will be some impact of the treatment on the quality of their life. Now, the main drug that I want to talk to you about tonight is a drug called lenvatinib, and I want to talk about lenvatinib because this is available on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme for the treatment of poorly differentiated or iodine refractory thyroid cancer. The drug acts as what is called a tyrosine kinase inhibitor. What that means is that it's able to block the actions of these things here that are called receptors. Now, a receptor is a bit like a lock in a door, and if you look at the cell membrane here, this thing right along here as being the door, with the locks in the door, normally these molecules, like PDGF, like VEGF, like FGF, which are a bit like a key, come along, jump into the lock, unlock the receptor, and then cause something to happen inside the cell which makes the cell go on and divide. Well, what a drug like lenvatinib does, and there are a number of these drugs, what these drugs do is they block the receptor. They actually gum up the lock, so they stop this transduction of a signal into the centre of the cell, into the nucleus of the cell, which causes the cell to divide. Now, lenvatinib targets a number of these receptors, but it's particularly active on the FGF receptor, but it does have activity against these other receptors as well. So, to help try to evaluate this, Martin Schlumberger led a major study of lenvatinib that was called the SELECT study. Martin Schlumberger is a big name in thyroid cancer from Paris, who's done a lot of the work that Geoff referred to earlier about choosing the right dose of radioactive iodine in patients. And this study compared patients being treated with lenvatinib or placebo. There are a large number of patients, 360 patients, who all had iodine refractory, poorly differentiated thyroid cancer. They all had measurable disease because they had to qualify by having measurable disease to get into this study, and they all had to have evidence of disease which was progressive. So this is a group of patients who are getting towards the end of their thyroid cancer journey. And in this study, when patients who were on either the drug or the placebo started to show signs of further progression, then it was assumed that they might have been receiving placebo, and so they were switched onto the active drug. So that's what's called a crossover study. And then they were all followed up until their disease progressed. This slide shows the major result from this study, and that is the overall response rate. That is, about 65% of patients actually responded to this treatment. And here is what's called the progression-free survival curves. Now, this is the period of time that the patients are able to be held without progression of their disease in this study. And clearly you can see that in the patients on lenvatinib, there is progression. It does eventually occur, so over a 24-month period, About 60% of the patients had shown progression, but you can see here that patients on placebo had shown much greater rates of progression. So there was beginning to be certainly a lot of enthusiasm when this data was seen, where progression-free survival in the treated patients was 18 months compared to 4 months with placebo. And there was some emerging evidence at that stage of an overall survival benefit. That led to lenvatinib being approved by the FDA in early 2015, and then subsequently it went on to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme here in Australia in 2016. There's relatively recently been some analysis of the overall survival data from the SELECT study, again showing a modest difference in the overall survival comparing patients treated with lenvatinib compared to patients treated with placebo. There is one other drug which is not uncommonly used. This is a drug called sorafenib, and I'm not standing up here doing a paid advertorial for lenvatinib, but this is the data showing the comparison of the progression-free survival curves for the drug sorafenib, which is another one of these tyrosine kinase inhibitors. Here is drug treatment, here is placebo, and that is in comparison with the results from the SELECT study, with the lenvatinib and placebo curves are shown here. This is exactly the same data that I showed you a couple of slides ago. So on that note, I might end. The purpose was really just to show you that for patients who do have radioactive iodine refractory thyroid cancer, this is a small percentage of patients, there are now treatments which are able to offer some hope of at least progression-free survival and perhaps a very modest increase in overall survival. Thank you very much.